What if I told you that the most powerful man on earth once held a dinner party where grown men crawled on the floor like animals, while the Pope himself sat on his throne, laughing and handing out gold coins as prizes? What if I told you this wasn't some medieval fairy tale, but a real event that happened in the holiest building in Christianity? And what if I told you this was just the beginning of a story so twisted, so shocking, that the Vatican spent 500 years trying to erase it from history? This isn't some Hollywood fantasy. This is the real story of Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, arguably the most scandalous pope in the history of the Catholic Church. And today, we're going to dive deep into the 8 strangest and darkest bedroom rules that this man created. Rules so twisted that they changed the course of European politics forever. You might be wondering, how could a pope, of all people, live like this? How did the Vatican become a playground for the rich and powerful? And most importantly, how much of what we've heard is actually true? Here's what you're going to learn in the next 2 hours. First, we'll explore the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts, an event so shocking that historians still debate whether it really happened. Then we'll uncover how Alexander turned family relationships into political weapons, using his own children as pawns in deadly games of power. We'll discover how he transformed intimacy into currency, literally buying and selling positions in the church with promises of pleasure. You'll learn about his network of lover spies who turned every whisper in the bedroom into intelligence for the Vatican. We'll examine the twisted lottery system that decided who would share the Pope's bed and how he used religious festivals as cover for the most unholy acts imaginable. But that's not all. We'll reveal the oath of silence that could mean the difference between life and death for anyone who entered his private chambers. And finally, we'll explore perhaps the darkest rule of all: how Alexander used poison to eliminate rivals, turning intimate encounters into death traps. Now, I want to be clear about something before we begin. Some of these stories come from Alexander's enemies, people who had every reason to spread lies about him. But here's the thing. Even if half of these accounts are exaggerated, what remains is still enough to make your jaw drop. The Borgia family didn't just rule the Catholic Church, they turned it into their personal empire. And Alexander VI? He was the mastermind who showed the world that power, pleasure, and politics could be mixed into a cocktail so intoxicating that it nearly brought down the Vatican itself. So, buckle up, because we're about to take a journey into one of history's darkest chapters. By the end of this video, you'll understand how one man's bedroom rules changed the face of Renaissance Europe, and why the Catholic Church spent centuries trying to erase this story from history. Are you ready to learn the truth about the Pope who turned the Vatican into his personal playground? Let's dive in. Rule number 1, the Banquet of Chestnuts. When holy became unholy, let me start with a question that's going to set the tone for everything we discuss today. What's the most shocking party you've ever heard of? Whatever you're thinking, I guarantee it doesn't come close to what happened in the Papal Palace on October 30th, 1501. This is the story of the Banquet of Chestnuts, an event so scandalous that it's been whispered about in hushed tones for over 500 years. Picture this scene. You're a guest in the most sacred building in Christianity. The walls around you are covered in priceless art commissioned by previous popes. Saints look down at you from golden frames, and crucifixes gleam in the candlelight. This is supposed to be the holiest place on earth. But tonight, something very different is happening. The man hosting this party is Alexander VI himself, dressed in his papal robes, sitting on a throne-like chair at the head of a massive table. Around him are 50 of the most powerful people in Rome: cardinals, nobles, wealthy merchants, and their wives. The air is thick with expensive perfume, wine, and anticipation. Now here's where things get interesting. According to the detailed account written by Johannes Burchard, the Pope's own master of ceremonies, what happened next would make a modern-day scandal look like a church picnic. Alexander had arranged for a group of courtesans, high-class prostitutes who served the Roman elite, to be brought into the papal dining hall. But these weren't just any entertainers. These women had been specifically chosen for their beauty and their willingness to participate in what was about to unfold. The Pope stood up, raised his jeweled hand, and made an announcement that silenced the room. Tonight, he declared, they would play a special game. Hundreds of chestnuts were scattered across the marble floor of the dining hall. The courtesans were ordered to crawl on their hands and knees, completely naked, picking up these chestnuts while the papal guests watched and cheered. But wait, it gets worse. As the women crawled around the floor like animals, collecting chestnuts in baskets, Alexander announced the second part of his twisted game. The men at the party, including several cardinals who had taken vows of celibacy, were invited to compete with the courtesans in acts of lust. Right there, in the papal dining hall, under the watchful eyes of religious artwork. And here's the part that really shows you Alexander's mindset. He didn't just watch, he judged. The Pope himself acted as the referee of this unholy competition, awarding prizes to whoever impressed him the most. We're talking about expensive jewelry, fine silk clothing, and bags of gold coins, all handed out by the supposed representative of God on earth. Johannes Burchard, who witnessed this entire event, wrote in his diary that the Pope laughed heartily throughout the evening and seemed to take particular pleasure in deciding who deserved the best rewards. Imagine being in that room, watching the head of the Catholic Church turn a sacred space into what can only be described as an orgy with a prize system. Now, you might be thinking, this can't be real. This has to be some kind of propaganda from Alexander's enemies. And you know what? You might be partially right. Many historians debate whether Burchard's account is entirely accurate or if it was exaggerated to damage the Borgia reputation. But here's the thing that makes this story so compelling. Johannes Burchard wasn't Alexander's enemy. He was the Pope's own employee, the master of ceremonies who had worked faithfully for the Vatican for decades. His job was to record official papal events, and he wrote his accounts in Latin, probably never expecting them to become public scandals. More importantly, this wasn't the only party like this. Historical records show that Alexander hosted similar events throughout his papacy. The banquet of chestnuts might have been the most extreme, but it was part of a pattern that defined his entire reign. So, what does this tell us about Alexander's first bedroom rule? It's simple but shocking. In the Borgia household, sacred spaces could be turned into stages for profane entertainment at will. The Pope didn't separate his public religious duties from his private desires. Instead, he used his absolute power to blend them together in ways that would have horrified previous church leaders. Think about the psychology behind this. Alexander wasn't just throwing a wild party, he was making a statement. By hosting these events in the papal palace, surrounded by religious art and symbols, he was showing everyone present that he considered himself above traditional moral rules. The bedroom rules of Alexander VI didn't just apply to his private chambers, they extended to any space he controlled. But there's another layer to this story that makes it even more disturbing. Many of the people at these parties weren't just there for entertainment. They were there because they needed something from the Pope: political favors, church positions, business deals, or protection from enemies. In Alexander's world, attending these events and participating in his games wasn't just about pleasure. It was about survival. If you wanted to maintain your position in Roman society, you had to play by the Pope's rules, no matter how twisted they were. This brings us to a crucial point about understanding Alexander VI. He didn't separate pleasure from politics. For him, they were the same thing. The banquet of chestnuts wasn't just a party. It was a demonstration of power. Everyone in that room learned that the Pope could make them do anything, anywhere, anytime. And here's the scariest part. It worked. Despite the scandal, despite the whispers, despite the obvious violation of every religious principle the Catholic Church claimed to uphold, Alexander remained Pope for 11 years. The people who attended his parties continued to support him, continued to seek his favor, and continued to participate in his twisted games. The Banquet of Chestnuts teaches us something important about power. When someone has absolute authority, they can rewrite the rules of morality itself. Alexander didn't just break the traditional boundaries between sacred and profane, he completely erased them. As we move forward in our story, remember this event, because everything we're about to discuss, the family manipulation, the political games, the deadly secrets, all of it grew out of the mindset that created the Banquet of Chestnuts. Alexander VI believed that his desires, no matter how dark, should shape the world around him. And unfortunately for everyone who crossed his path, he had the power to make that belief a reality. Rule number 2, family in the bedroom. When blood became currency, now we're going to talk about something deeply unsettling. And honestly, it should make you uncomfortable, because what we're about to explore is how Alexander VI turned family itself into a weapon of power. Let me ask you this. What would you do if someone used their own children as pawns in a deadly game of politics? Most parents would sacrifice everything to protect their kids. But Alexander VI had a very different idea. He used his children, especially his daughter Lucretia, as pieces on the chessboard of Europe. And here's the shocking part. As Pope, Alexander VI was supposed to live in celibacy, dedicating his life entirely to the Church. Instead, he openly acknowledged at least 7 children, and likely had more he never named. These weren't hidden relationships. He flaunted them, and he used papal resources to advance their power. But Lucretia was different. She was Alexander's favorite, his brilliant and beautiful daughter, who became one of the most talked about women of the Renaissance. Alexander had plans for her that would chill any ordinary father to the core. Here's how his second bedroom rule worked. Family members, especially daughters, were treated as tools of diplomacy. Their marriages and even their reputations became bargaining chips. Lucretia's first marriage was arranged when she was just 13 years old. Think about that. Barely a teenager and already bound in a contract of power. When the alliance no longer served him, Alexander annulled the marriage by claiming it had never been consummated. He even pressured her husband, Giovanni Sforza, into public humiliation, suggesting he prove his capability before others. Giovanni refused, and the marriage was erased as if it had never existed. And then the whispers began. Across Rome, people murmured about Alexander's special affection for his daughter. Ambassadors wrote uneasy letters. Citizens gossiped about late-night visits. Even foreign kings made cruel jokes. Were these rumors true? We may never know. But the fact that people believed them at all shows how blurred the boundaries in Alexander's household had become. Think about it. This was a man who threw shameless feasts in the Vatican itself. Why would family bonds be any more sacred to him than vows to God? Alexander often staged private dinners where Lucretia sat at his side, and powerful men quickly understood the unspoken message. Earn the Pope's favor, and access to his daughter might follow. These evenings were never innocent. They were political traps. A man's reaction to Lucretia could decide his fate. It became a game of psychological warfare. Alexander held out temptation on one hand and destruction on the other. If you showed desire, he could use it against you. If you pretended indifference, he might mark you as an enemy. And what about Lucretia? History paints her as intelligent, sharp, and aware of how her role was being shaped. Some accounts suggest she even learned to turn this manipulation into her own power, observing men, testing them, and reporting back to her father. In a sense, she became a weapon sharpened by his hand. This was the true darkness of Alexander's family rule. He didn't just use his children as tools. He trained them to see love and loyalty as weapons. Lucrezia mastered charm as a political strategy. Her brothers learned to use romance for intelligence. The Borgia household became a school of manipulation unlike anything Europe had seen. And the impact spread far beyond Rome. Other families copied these tactics, turning their own children into bargaining chips. Across Europe, people began to whisper about the Borgia way of politics. Some recoiled, others imitated. But here lies the tragedy. Alexander built power, but he destroyed the possibility of ordinary family life. In his world, affection was never real. Marriage was never personal. Every bond was a transaction. Lucrezia never knew a normal romance. Every husband was chosen for her father's advantage. Every friendship came with hidden strings. Even her relationships with her brothers were tangled in politics. And that is the horror of Alexander's second rule. He turned family into currency. In his world, intimacy was a transaction, loyalty was a tool, and even the most sacred bond, a parent and child, was sacrificed at the altar of ambition. Rule number 3, power as a reward. The papal bedroom becomes a throne room. Imagine for a moment that you could buy a promotion at work with sexual favors. Sounds impossible in today's world, right? Well, welcome to Renaissance Rome, where Alexander VI turned this twisted concept into the foundation of his entire power structure. Let me tell you about the third bedroom rule that made Alexander VI one of the most feared and influential men in European history. Satisfying the Pope or his favorites in intimate encounters could earn you instant access to the highest positions in the Catholic Church. We're not talking about small favors here. We're talking about bishoprics that controlled vast territories, abbeys that generated enormous wealth, and cardinalships that put you just one step below the Pope himself. In Alexander's Vatican, your bedroom performance could literally determine whether you lived as a peasant or died as a prince of the church. Here's how this system actually worked, and trust me, it's going to blow your mind. Alexander had transformed his private chambers into what historians now call an alternative throne room. While he held official audiences during the day in traditional papal settings, the real power decisions were made at night, behind closed doors, with very different criteria for success. Let me give you a specific example that shows just how brazen this system was. In 1493, a young man named Alessandro Farnese was struggling to advance his career in the church hierarchy. He was intelligent and ambitious, but so were hundreds of other young clergymen in Rome. What made Alessandro special was his sister, Giulia Farnese, who happened to be one of the most beautiful women in Italy. Now here's where it gets interesting. Giulia became Alexander's mistress, and suddenly, her brother Alessandro's career took off like a rocket. Within months of Giulia entering the Pope's bedroom, Alessandro was promoted to cardinal. He was just 25 years old, making him one of the youngest cardinals in church history. But that's not even the shocking part. Alessandro Farnese, thanks to his sister's sacrifices, eventually became Pope Paul III. The papal bedroom politics of Alexander VI literally created a future pope. Let that sink in for a moment. The Catholic Church was being run by men who owed their positions to bedroom favors performed decades earlier. And Alessandro wasn't unique. Historical records show that Alexander promoted dozens of men to high church positions based primarily on their family connections to his bedroom activities. Brothers, fathers, sons, and husbands of his lovers suddenly found themselves controlling vast church territories and enormous wealth. But here's where Alexander's genius, and I use that word reluctantly, really shows. He didn't just use sex as a reward system. He created an entire economy based on desire and satisfaction. Think of it as the world's most exclusive and dangerous dating app where swiping right could make you a millionaire, but disappointing the Pope could get you killed. Alexander established what court observers called the bedroom lottery. On certain nights, he would host intimate gatherings in his private chambers where church positions were literally auctioned off to the highest bidder. But instead of paying with gold, guests paid with promises of sexual favors, family connections to attractive women, or their own participation in the Pope's twisted games. Let me describe one of these events to you, based on accounts from multiple historical sources. Picture a private dining room in the papal palace, lit by expensive candles and decorated with priceless art. About 20 powerful men are seated around a table, eating the finest food and drinking the best wine in Europe. Alexander enters wearing informal robes, probably silk or velvet, looking more like a wealthy merchant than the spiritual leader of millions of Catholics. He's smiling, relaxed, treating this like a casual dinner party among friends. Then he drops the bombshell. Tonight, he's giving away the abbacy of a wealthy monastery in northern Italy. This position comes with control over thousands of acres of land, hundreds of peasant families, and an annual income that would make modern millionaires jealous. But he's not selling it for money. Instead, he's looking for the man who can provide him with the most interesting entertainment. Maybe it's access to a beautiful daughter or sister. Maybe it's participation in one of his twisted games. Maybe it's simply the willingness to humiliate yourself for his amusement. The men around that table had to make an impossible choice. They could maintain their dignity and watch someone else walk away with a fortune, or they could debase themselves and their families for a chance at ultimate power and wealth. And here's the truly disturbing part. Most of them chose power. Historical accounts describe grown men, some of them already holding important church positions, competing with each other to offer Alexander the most degrading or exotic forms of entertainment. Fathers offered their daughters. Husbands offered their wives. Some men offered themselves. Alexander would sit back, evaluate these offers like a king reviewing tribute from conquered territories, and then make his decision. The winner walked away with enough wealth and power to transform their family's future for generations. The losers? Well, they learned not to disappoint the Pope a second time. But Alexander's bedroom reward system went even deeper than individual appointments. He used sexual satisfaction as a way to distribute entire territories and reshape the political map of Europe. Church lands in Italy weren't just religious holdings. They were independent states with their own armies, laws, and economies. When Alexander appointed new bishops and abbots based on bedroom politics, he was essentially giving away countries to his sexual partners and their families. A single night of pleasing the Pope could result in your family controlling a territory larger than many modern nations. This created a ripple effect throughout European politics. Suddenly, every major family was trying to figure out how to get access to Alexander's bedroom. Royal courts across Europe began recruiting beautiful women specifically to send to Rome as potential papal mistresses. It became a form of international diplomacy conducted through sexual networks. The French court sent attractive noblewomen to Rome with instructions to seduce their way into Alexander's inner circle. Spanish families did the same thing. Even German princes, despite their growing religious differences with Rome, participated in this twisted system because the potential rewards were too great to ignore. And here's what makes this historically significant. Alexander's bedroom reward system didn't just corrupt the Catholic Church, it changed how power worked throughout Renaissance Europe. Other rulers began copying his methods, using sexual access as a way to distribute political favors and build loyalty networks. But there was a dark side to this system that went beyond simple corruption. Because advancement in the church became tied to sexual performance rather than religious devotion or administrative skill, the quality of church leadership plummeted. Men who should have been spiritual leaders were instead focused on maintaining their positions through continued sexual networking. This created a cascade of corruption that flowed down through every level of the church hierarchy. Bishops appointed through bedroom politics appointed priests the same way. Abbots chosen for their family's sexual connections did the same thing when selecting their subordinates. Within a few years, significant portions of the Catholic Church in Italy were being run by men whose primary qualification was their connection to Alexander's sexual network. Church funds were diverted to support luxurious lifestyles. Religious ceremonies became secondary to political maneuvering, and the spiritual needs of ordinary Catholics were largely forgotten. The most tragic part of this system was how it trapped everyone involved. Once you participated in Alexander's bedroom politics, you could never really leave. Your position, your wealth, your family's future, everything depended on maintaining the Pope's sexual satisfaction. This created a network of powerful people who were all completely dependent on continuing Alexander's twisted games. And as we'll see in our next section, Alexander used this dependency to create something even more sinister: a spy network that turned intimate relationships into intelligence operations where pillow talk became a matter of life and death. Rule number 4: lovers as spies. When pillow talk became intelligence, what's the most private moment in a person's life? Most people would say it's those intimate conversations you have with someone you trust completely. Those moments when you're vulnerable, unguarded, and sharing your deepest secrets. Alexander VI turned those moments into weapons. Welcome to the fourth and perhaps most psychologically twisted of Alexander's bedroom rules. Every intimate relationship in his orbit was simultaneously an intelligence operation where lovers were required to spy on each other for the benefit of the papal throne. Let me explain how this worked, because it's more sophisticated and more disturbing than anything you've seen in modern spy movies. Alexander understood something that most rulers of his time missed. People say things during intimate moments that they would never reveal in public. When someone is lying next to you, feeling safe and connected, they'll tell you about their fears, their plans, their secret alliances, and their vulnerabilities. For most people, this intimacy creates trust and deepens relationships. For Alexander, it was the most valuable intelligence network in European history. Here's how he built this system. Every woman who entered Alexander's romantic circle, whether as his personal mistress or as entertainment for his guests, was given a secondary mission that was never discussed openly, but was always understood: gather information and report back. But this wasn't casual eavesdropping. Alexander created a sophisticated intelligence operation that would make modern spy agencies jealous. His lovers were trained to ask specific questions, to steer conversations toward particular topics, and to remember exact quotes that could be used later as political weapons. Let me tell you about Vannozza Catanei, one of Alexander's most successful long-term mistresses, and the mother of 4 of his children, including Lucrezia. Historical accounts describe Vannozza as intelligent, charming, and absolutely ruthless when it came to gathering information for Alexander. Vannozza wasn't just a mistress, she was Alexander's chief intelligence officer. She maintained relationships with powerful men throughout Rome, and every conversation, every dinner party, every casual encounter became an opportunity to gather secrets that could be used to advance Alexander's political goals. But here's what made this system so effective. Vannozza's targets had no idea they were being interrogated. They thought they were flirting with a beautiful woman at a social gathering. They had no clue that their casual comments about political alliances or financial difficulties were being memorized and reported directly to the Pope. Alexander trained his lovers to be expert psychological manipulators. They learned to make men feel special, understood, and desired. They mastered the art of asking leading questions that seemed like innocent curiosity, but were actually sophisticated intelligence-gathering techniques. For example, one of Alexander's mistresses might say something like, "You seem worried about something. You know you can tell me anything. I would never judge you." It sounds like romantic concern, right? But it was actually a trained interrogation technique designed to get men to reveal their weaknesses and fears. And it worked incredibly well. Powerful men who would never dream of sharing strategic information in a formal political setting would spill their deepest secrets to women they thought cared about them personally. But Alexander's spy network went far beyond his own romantic relationships. He also used his lovers as recruiting agents, turning them into handlers who managed their own networks of informants. Here's how this worked. When one of Alexander's mistresses developed a relationship with a powerful man, she would gradually introduce him to other attractive women in Alexander's network. These secondary relationships created additional intelligence streams, while also compromising more people and making them dependent on Alexander's continued goodwill. Think about the psychological warfare involved here. Alexander wasn't just gathering information, he was creating situations where powerful men were emotionally and sexually dependent on women who reported directly to him. This gave him incredible leverage over some of the most important political figures in Europe. Let me give you a specific example of how devastating this could be. In 1497, a Neapolitan nobleman named Francesco Orsini was negotiating a secret military alliance against Alexander's interests. Orsini thought his plans were completely confidential. He had only discussed them with his most trusted advisors and his beloved mistress, a woman named Caterina who seemed to adore him. What Orsini didn't know was that Caterina had been recruited into Alexander's network months earlier. Every detail of Orsini's military plans was reported directly to the Pope, who used this information to outmaneuver the conspiracy before it could threaten his position. But Alexander didn't just stop at defeating Orsini's plans. He used the intelligence gathered by Caterina to completely destroy Orsini's reputation and political career. Because Alexander knew about Orsini's secret military preparations, he was able to expose them publicly at the perfect moment, making Orsini look like a traitor and a fool. The most psychologically disturbing part of this story? Caterina continued her relationship with Orsini even after his downfall, comforting him in his defeat while secretly reporting to Alexander about his emotional state and any attempts he might make to rebuild his political career. This is what made Alexander's spy network so effective. It wasn't just about gathering information. It was about creating permanent psychological control over his targets. Once someone had shared intimate secrets with one of Alexander's agents, they could never be sure those secrets wouldn't be used against them later. And Alexander made sure his targets knew this, in subtle but unmistakable ways. He would occasionally reference information in public conversations that he could only have learned through intimate relationships. He never directly threatened anyone, but the message was clear. I know your secrets, and I can destroy you anytime I choose. This created a climate of paranoia throughout Roman high society. Men began to suspect their own lovers of being papal spies. Trust between romantic partners became almost impossible because everyone knew that pillow talk could end up in papal intelligence reports. But here's where Alexander's system became truly diabolical. He didn't just spy on his enemies. He spied on his allies, his friends, and even his own family members. No relationship was sacred, no confidence was safe, and no secret was truly private. Alexander's lovers were instructed to report on everyone they encountered, regardless of their relationship to the Pope. This meant that even Alexander's closest supporters could never be completely sure of their safety, because they never knew when something they said in an intimate moment might be used against them. The psychological impact of this system extended far beyond Rome. As word spread about Alexander's intelligence network, it changed how powerful people throughout Europe conducted their romantic relationships. Paranoia about papal spies became so widespread that some nobles began avoiding romantic relationships entirely, afraid that any intimacy could compromise their political positions. And here's perhaps the most tragic aspect of Alexander's spy network. It didn't just destroy trust between political enemies. It made genuine love almost impossible for anyone in his orbit. When every romantic relationship is potentially an intelligence operation, how can anyone ever truly open their heart to another person? Alexander's lovers themselves paid a terrible psychological price for their involvement in this system. Historical accounts describe women who became skilled at compartmentalizing their emotions, learning to perform love convincingly while never actually feeling it. They mastered the art of intimacy without vulnerability, creating the appearance of deep connection while maintaining complete emotional detachment. Some of these women eventually broke down under the psychological strain of constantly manipulating people they claimed to care about. Others became so skilled at deception that they lost the ability to form genuine relationships with anyone, including Alexander himself. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy of Alexander's intelligence network was how it normalized the use of intimacy as a weapon. Other European rulers began copying his methods, creating their own networks of lover spies and turning romantic relationships into tools of statecraft. This fundamentally changed European politics, creating a culture where personal relationships were always suspected of having ulterior motives. The paranoia and manipulation that Alexander introduced into Renaissance romance had effects that lasted for centuries, poisoning the well of trust that healthy societies depend on. As we'll see in our next section, Alexander took this culture of manipulation even further, turning intimate encounters into literal games of chance where lives and fortunes were decided by random drawing, creating what became known as the infamous bedroom lottery. Rule number 5, the bedroom lottery. When intimacy became a game of chance, picture this scenario. You're at what you think is an elegant dinner party in the most powerful palace in Europe. The wine is flowing, the conversation is sophisticated, and you're feeling pretty good about your social connections. Then your host, who happens to be the Pope, announces that it's time for tonight's entertainment. He pulls out a silk bag filled with pieces of parchment. On each piece is written the name of one of the guests. Tonight, he explains with a smile that makes your blood run cold, fate will decide who shares his bed. Welcome to Alexander VI's bedroom lottery, the fifth twisted rule that turned intimate encounters into games of chance, where the stakes were higher than anyone could imagine. This wasn't just some rumor spread by Alexander's enemies. Multiple historical sources, including accounts from papal staff and foreign ambassadors, describe a systematic practice where Alexander used random selection to choose sexual partners at private gatherings, but calling it a lottery actually understates how sophisticated and psychologically manipulative this system really was. Let me explain how this worked, because the details are going to shock you. Alexander's bedroom lottery wasn't a spontaneous game. It was a carefully orchestrated psychological operation designed to maximize his power and control over Rome's elite. The random selection process was actually a form of sexual terrorism that kept everyone in his orbit off balance and completely dependent on his whims. Here's how a typical lottery evening would unfold. Alexander would host what appeared to be a normal social gathering in his private apartments. The guest list was always carefully curated. Powerful men and their wives, attractive unmarried women from noble families, wealthy merchants seeking papal favor, and church officials looking to advance their careers. The evening would start normally enough. Elegant dinner, expensive wine, sophisticated conversation about art, politics, and culture. Alexander was famous for being charming and entertaining at these events, making his guests feel special and privileged to be included in such exclusive gatherings. But then, usually after several hours of socializing, when everyone was relaxed and had consumed significant amounts of alcohol, Alexander would make his announcement. Tonight, he would declare, they were going to play a special game that would bring them all closer together. The silk bag would appear, containing parchments with names written in elegant script. But here's what made this so psychologically devastating. Nobody knew whose names were in the bag until the drawing began. Married women didn't know if their husbands had volunteered them. Ambitious men didn't know if they had been entered by someone seeking papal favor. Young women didn't know if their fathers had offered them as political sacrifices. Alexander would, Alexander, shake the bag dramatically, building tension in the room. Then he would draw a name, or sometimes multiple names, and announce the evening's winners. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Relief for those not chosen mixed with terror for those who were, while everyone wondered who had put their name in the bag in the first place. But here's where Alexander's genius for manipulation really showed. He never revealed who had submitted each name. This created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that extended far beyond the immediate evening. Husbands suspected wives of volunteering them. Parents wondered if their children had been offered as bargaining chips. Business partners questioned each other's loyalty. Let me tell you about one specific incident that shows just how twisted this system was. In 1499, Alexander hosted one of these lottery evenings for about 30 guests, including several prominent Roman families. Among the attendees were Giuliano della Rovere's nephew and his beautiful wife, Caterina. When Alexander drew Caterina's name from the bag, her husband's face went white. He had no idea how her name had gotten there, and the uncertainty was almost worse than the actual selection. Had someone else volunteered his wife? Had she entered herself? Had Alexander simply added her name without anyone's knowledge? The psychological torture of not knowing was exactly what Alexander wanted, because uncertainty creates fear, and fear creates dependence. People who are constantly worried about being selected in the next lottery are much more likely to do whatever it takes to stay in the host's good graces. But the bedroom lottery served another purpose that was even more sinister. It created a culture where sexual coercion could be disguised as random chance. When someone was selected, it wasn't Alexander making a demand, it was fate making a choice. This gave everyone involved a psychological way to rationalize participating in activities they would normally find morally repugnant. Think about the mental gymnastics this created. A devoted husband could tell himself that he wasn't really betraying his wife by participating. After all, his name was drawn randomly. A faithful wife could convince herself that she wasn't really choosing to be unfaithful. She was just unlucky in a game of chance. This psychological cover made it much easier for Alexander to coerce participation from people who would never have agreed to direct sexual propositions. The lottery system provided just enough plausible deniability to overcome initial moral objections. And Alexander made sure to emphasize the random nature of the selections, even when everyone suspected the game was rigged. He would make a great show of shaking the bag, of drawing blindly, of expressing surprise at certain selections. It was all theater, but it was effective theater that maintained the illusion of chance, even when the outcomes were clearly predetermined. Historical accounts suggest that Alexander often knew exactly which names he was going to draw before the evening began. The lottery was just a performance designed to make his sexual demands seem less threatening and more socially acceptable. Instead of commanding specific people to his bed, he was simply following the whims of fate. But here's where this system became truly diabolical. Alexander began using the lottery to test loyalty and punish disloyalty in ways that seemed completely random. If someone had disappointed him politically or financially, their name was more likely to appear in the bag. If someone had pleased him, their spouse might be mysteriously absent from the selection process. This created a feedback loop where people began trying to influence their odds in the lottery by providing Alexander with better political intelligence, more generous financial contributions, or more enthusiastic participation in his other twisted games. The randomness of the system actually made people more desperate to curry favor, not less, and the psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate participants. Word of Alexander's bedroom lottery spread throughout European high society, creating a climate where powerful people lived in constant fear of being selected for sexual service to the Pope. This fear made them more compliant with Alexander's political demands and less likely to oppose his controversial policies. Some families began avoiding papal gatherings entirely, preferring to lose political influence rather than risk being selected in the lottery. Others tried to game the system by volunteering family members proactively, hoping that voluntary participation would earn them better treatment in future political negotiations. The bedroom lottery also created a twisted form of social currency where being selected was sometimes seen as a mark of status rather than humiliation. Because Alexander only invited the most powerful and influential people to these gatherings, being chosen could be interpreted as a sign that you were important enough to warrant papal attention. This psychological complexity made the lottery even more effective as a tool of control. People couldn't simply reject participation outright, because doing so might indicate that they considered themselves above papal notice, a dangerous position to take in Alexander's Rome. The most tragic aspect of the bedroom lottery was how it normalized sexual coercion throughout Roman society. When the Pope himself used games of chance to select sexual partners, it became easier for other powerful men to justify similar behavior. The lottery system spread beyond the papal palace, becoming a twisted form of entertainment at noble gatherings throughout Italy. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy of Alexander's bedroom lottery was how it demonstrated that sexual violence could be made socially acceptable through the right framing. By disguising coercion as chance and demand as fate, Alexander showed other rulers how to commit acts that would normally provoke outrage while maintaining social respectability. As we'll see in our next section, Alexander's manipulation of social norms became even more extreme when he began using religious festivals themselves as cover for the most unholy activities imaginable. Rule number 6. Sacred days, profane nights. The holy calendar becomes a schedule for sin. There's something uniquely disturbing about using religious holidays as an excuse for the exact opposite of what those holidays represent. It's like celebrating Christmas by stealing presents or marking Easter by denying resurrection. But Alexander VI took this kind of twisted irony to levels that would make Satan himself impressed. Let me introduce you to the 6th bedroom rule that defined Alexander's papacy. The most sacred days of the Catholic calendar became opportunities for the most profane activities imaginable, turning holy festivals into covers for unholy acts. This wasn't just casual hypocrisy. Alexander created a systematic practice of using religious observances as both cover and justification for activities that directly violated everything those observances represented. And the psychological impact of this inversion was more devastating than you might imagine. Picture this. It's Good Friday, 1501. Across the Christian world, millions of faithful Catholics are observing the most solemn day of their religious calendar, the day commemorating Christ's crucifixion and death. Churches are draped in black. Believers are fasting, praying, and contemplating the ultimate sacrifice made for their salvation. But in the papal palace, something very different is happening. According to multiple historical accounts, including detailed reports from shocked foreign ambassadors, Alexander chose this holiest of days to host one of his most elaborate sexual celebrations. While Christians throughout Europe were mourning Christ's death, the Pope was celebrating the resurrection of his own lustful desires. The symbolism was intentional and devastating. Alexander wasn't just ignoring religious observances, he was actively inverting them, using the spiritual energy and attention focused on sacred events to amplify the shock and power of his profane activities. Here's how this worked psychologically. When you violate a taboo on an ordinary day, it's shocking, but containable. When you violate that same taboo on the day specifically set aside to honor what you're violating, the impact is exponentially greater. Alexander understood that timing his twisted activities to coincide with religious festivals would maximize their psychological impact on everyone involved. Let me tell you about Christmas Eve, 1492, just a few months after Alexander became pope. While churches throughout Rome were preparing for midnight masses celebrating the birth of Christ, Alexander was hosting what contemporary accounts describe as a nativity celebration of an entirely different sort. The papal palace was decorated with expensive tapestries and golden ornaments, creating an atmosphere of luxury that mocked the humble circumstances of Christ's birth. Instead of celebrating the virgin birth, Alexander was celebrating decidedly non-virgin activities with a carefully selected group of Roman nobility and their most attractive family members. But here's what made this so psychologically devastating. Alexander didn't try to hide what he was doing. Instead, he made sure that word of his counter-celebrations spread throughout Rome. He wanted people to know that while they were observing religious restrictions and contemplating spiritual matters, he was indulging in every pleasure those restrictions were designed to prevent. The message was clear. Religious observances were for ordinary people. Alexander, as pope, was above such limitations. He could simultaneously represent divine authority and violate divine commandments without consequence. This created a profound psychological crisis for devout Catholics in Rome and throughout Europe. How do you reconcile your faith when the earthly representative of that faith is systematically violating its most fundamental principles on its most sacred days? Alexander's timing wasn't random. Historical analysis shows that he specifically chose religious festivals that emphasized themes directly opposite to his planned activities. Easter celebrations of resurrection became opportunities for activities that medieval theology associated with spiritual death. Feast days honoring virgin saints became occasions for the most decidedly non-virgin entertainment. The Feast of the Assumption, celebrating the Virgin Mary's ascension to heaven, became an annual occasion for Alexander's most elaborate sexual festivities. The irony was so blatant that even his supporters found it difficult to rationalize. But Alexander's profane use of sacred days served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple shock value. First, it demonstrated his absolute power over the Catholic Church. By violating religious observances without consequences, he showed everyone that papal authority trumped divine authority, at least in the earthly realm. Second, it created a test of loyalty for his supporters. People who were willing to participate in activities that directly contradicted their religious beliefs on sacred days proved their absolute devotion to Alexander personally, regardless of their theoretical devotion to the faith he represented. Third, it provided psychological cover for other violations. If the Pope could violate the most sacred observances of the Catholic calendar, then lesser violations of church law and moral principles seemed relatively insignificant by comparison. Let me describe one particularly shocking example from Palm Sunday, 1498. This is the day Christians commemorate Christ's triumphant entry into Jerusalem, traditionally observed with processions, prayers, and contemplation of Jesus' final week before crucifixion. Alexander organized his own triumphant entry celebration, but instead of honoring Christ's spiritual victory, he was celebrating his own political and sexual conquests. The papal apartments were filled with Roman nobility, church officials, and an array of entertainers whose activities would have horrified any genuine Christian observer. According to detailed accounts from Johannes Burchard, Alexander's master of ceremonies, the Pope spent Palm Sunday conducting what could only be described as a sexual auction, where church positions were literally sold to the highest bidder in terms of intimate favors provided to papal favorites. The psychological impact of this timing was devastating. Palm Sunday represents hope, spiritual triumph, and the beginning of Christianity's most important week. By using this day for activities that represented the exact opposite of Christian values, Alexander was essentially declaring war on the spiritual meaning of Christianity itself. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Alexander often incorporated religious symbolism into his profane activities, creating twisted parodies of sacred rituals. Contemporary accounts describe events where participants wore religious vestments while engaging in decidedly non-religious activities, where sacred music played in the background of profane entertainments, and where religious artifacts were used as props in sexual games. This wasn't just violation of religious principles. It was deliberate desecration designed to maximize psychological impact. Alexander understood that combining sacred symbols with profane activities would create a level of shock and disorientation that simple debauchery couldn't achieve. The impact of this systematic desecration extended far beyond Rome. Reports of Alexander's twisted holiday celebrations spread throughout European courts, creating a crisis of confidence in the Catholic Church that contributed to the Protestant Reformation just a few decades later. When Martin Luther began questioning papal authority, he didn't need to make up scandals about church corruption. He could simply point to well-documented accounts of how Alexander VI had turned the holiest days of Christianity into opportunities for the most unholy activities imaginable. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Alexander's profane use of sacred days was how it affected ordinary believers. Imagine being a devout Catholic who had planned to spend Good Friday in prayer and contemplation, only to learn that your spiritual leader was spending the same day hosting orgies in the papal palace. This created a spiritual crisis for millions of people who had built their lives around faith in the Catholic Church's moral authority. How do you maintain religious devotion when the head of your religion is systematically violating everything that religion stands for? Some believers responded by separating their faith from their opinion of the Pope, arguing that Alexander's personal corruption didn't invalidate Catholic teachings. Others lost their faith entirely, concluding that any institution that could be led by someone like Alexander couldn't possibly represent divine truth. Still others adopted a cynical attitude toward religion in general, viewing it as a political tool rather than a spiritual path. This cynicism about religious authority had profound effects on European culture that lasted for centuries. Alexander's inversion of sacred and profane also established a precedent that influenced how future corrupt leaders operated. By showing that even the most sacred symbols and observances could be twisted to serve personal desires, he created a playbook for using religious authority to justify almost any behavior. As we'll see in our next section, Alexander took this manipulation of trust and authority even further, creating systems of secrecy so complete that they turned intimacy itself into a potential death sentence. Rule number 7, the rule of secrecy. When silence became a matter of life and death, what's the most dangerous secret you've ever kept? Maybe it was something that could hurt someone's feelings, damage their reputation, or cost them their job. Now imagine keeping a secret where failure meant not just social embarrassment or professional consequences, but actual death. Welcome to Alexander VI's 7th bedroom rule. Absolute silence about anything witnessed in the papal private chambers, enforced by an oath so binding that breaking it meant exile, imprisonment, or mysterious disappearance. This wasn't just about maintaining privacy. Alexander created a system of enforced secrecy so complete and so terrifying that it turned every intimate encounter into a potential death trap, where the wrong word to the wrong person could end your life. Let me explain how this system worked, because it's more sophisticated and more brutal than anything you see in modern organized crime. First, understand that Alexander's secrecy requirements weren't limited to his sexual partners. Everyone who entered his private chambers, servants, guards, entertainers, guests, church officials, even family members, had to swear what became known as the Borgia Oath. This oath wasn't a casual promise or a gentleman's agreement. It was a formal, ritualized ceremony that took place in Alexander's private chapel, conducted with all the solemnity of a religious sacrament. Participants had to place their hand on sacred relics, swear before God and multiple witnesses, and accept specific punishments for any breach of silence. But here's what made the Borgia Oath so psychologically devastating. It didn't just require silence about specific events. It required absolute silence about anything and everything that occurred in Alexander's presence, no matter how innocent or how damaging. Think about the psychological pressure this created. If you witnessed Alexander doing something relatively minor, maybe just showing favoritism to one cardinal over another, you couldn't mention it to anyone. But if you witnessed something truly shocking, like the Pope participating in activities that would destroy the Catholic Church if they became public, you still couldn't say a word. This created a situation where people carrying minor secrets lived in the same constant terror as people carrying earth-shattering secrets, because the penalty for breaking the oath was the same regardless of the significance of the information. Let me tell you about what happened to Paolo Orsini, a Roman nobleman who made the mistake of thinking the Borgia Oath was just ceremonial intimidation. In 1496, Paolo attended one of Alexander's private gatherings, where he witnessed activities that shocked even his worldly sensibilities. A few weeks later, during a casual conversation at a Roman social event, Paolo made a vague reference to unusual entertainments at the papal palace. He didn't provide details, didn't mention specific people, and didn't even explicitly describe what he had seen. It was the kind of subtle hint that sophisticated people use to show they're in the know without actually revealing sensitive information. Within days, Paolo received a message summoning him to a private meeting with Cesare Borgia, Alexander's son and enforcer. Paolo assumed this was routine political business. After all, he had maintained good relationships with the Borgia family for years. Paolo was never seen alive again. His body was found floating in the Tiber River a week later, bearing signs of torture that contemporary observers described as instructional, designed to send a message rather than simply kill efficiently. The message was received loud and clear throughout Roman society. The Borgia Oath wasn't symbolic. It was literally a matter of life and death. But Alexander's secrecy system went far beyond simple threats and punishment. He created an elaborate network of surveillance designed to detect oath violations before they could spread damaging information. Here's how this worked. Alexander planted informants throughout Roman society whose specific job was to listen for any references, however subtle, to papal private activities. These informants weren't just focused on direct participants in papal gatherings. They monitored conversations among family members, servants, business associates, and even casual acquaintances of anyone who had taken the Borgia Oath. The psychological impact of this surveillance network was enormous. People who had sworn the oath lived in constant fear that even their most careful conversations were being monitored. They couldn't trust their spouses, their children, their closest friends, or even their servants, because anyone might be reporting to Alexander's intelligence network. This created a culture of paranoia so intense that many oath-takers began avoiding social interactions entirely. Historical accounts describe Roman nobles who became reclusive and withdrawn after attending papal gatherings, afraid that any normal conversation might accidentally reveal something that could be interpreted as an oath violation. But Alexander's enforcement of secrecy wasn't limited to external surveillance. He also used psychological manipulation to ensure internal compliance with his silence requirements. One of his most effective techniques was what court observers called confession sessions. During private gatherings, Alexander would sometimes call participants aside individually and ask them to reveal what they had heard other people saying about papal activities. These sessions served multiple purposes. First, they identified potential oath violators before they could spread damaging information. Second, they turned participants into accomplices in the surveillance system, making them complicit in enforcing the very secrecy that trapped them. Third, they created additional psychological pressure by making everyone wonder who was reporting on whom. The genius of this system was that it made oath violations seem simultaneously inevitable and catastrophically dangerous. People lived in constant fear that they might accidentally reveal something, while also worrying that someone else might falsely accuse them of revealing something they hadn't actually said. Let me give you another specific example of how ruthlessly Alexander enforced his secrecy rules. In 1499, a young priest named Father Michel served as a chaplain during one of Alexander's private religious ceremonies that were religious in name only and decidedly profane in practice. Father Michel was horrified by what he witnessed and struggled with his conscience for months. Finally, he approached his bishop seeking guidance about how to handle knowledge of papal activities that seemed to violate fundamental Catholic principles. The bishop, who was more politically savvy than Father Michel, immediately reported this conversation to papal authorities. Within hours, Father Michel was arrested on charges of heresy, charges that carried a potential death penalty. But Alexander's response was even more psychologically devastating than simple execution. Instead of killing Father Michel immediately, he was imprisoned in a papal dungeon where he was forced to watch other oath violators being tortured and killed. The message was clear. This is what happens to people who even think about breaking their silence. Father Michel was eventually released after 2 years of imprisonment, but he was a broken man who never spoke again, not just about papal activities, but about anything at all. He spent the rest of his life as a mute hermit, serving as a living reminder of the consequences of violating Alexander's secrecy requirements. This kind of extreme enforcement created what historians now call traumatic silence, a psychological condition where the fear of speaking about forbidden topics becomes so intense that it affects the ability to speak about anything at all. Multiple historical accounts describe people who attended Alexander's private gatherings developing speech difficulties, memory problems, and severe anxiety disorders that lasted for years after their experiences. The psychological trauma of living under such extreme secrecy requirements was literally driving people insane. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Alexander's secrecy system was how it corrupted the very concept of truth itself. When people are forbidden from speaking about their experiences, those experiences begin to feel unreal, like nightmares that might not have actually happened. This psychological effect served Alexander's purposes perfectly. People who couldn't talk about what they had witnessed began to doubt their own memories, questioning whether the shocking events they remembered had really occurred or were just products of their imagination. This doubt made them less likely to violate their oaths even when they wanted to because they weren't sure if they had anything real to reveal. Alexander had essentially weaponized gaslighting, using enforced silence to make people question their own perception of reality. The secrecy system also created a twisted form of intimacy between Alexander and his victims. Sharing dangerous secrets created psychological bonds that were simultaneously traumatic and addictive. People who had sworn the Borgia Oath often found themselves craving return invitations to papal gatherings, despite being terrified of what they might witness there. This psychological dependency made Alexander's control even more complete. His victims weren't just afraid of breaking their silence, they were psychologically addicted to the very experiences that traumatized them. As we'll see in our final section, Alexander's mastery of psychological manipulation reached its ultimate expression in his use of poison, where the most intimate gestures of hospitality became potential death sentences. Rule number 8, poisoned intimacy. When love became lethal, imagine sharing a romantic dinner with someone you trust completely. The wine is perfect, the conversation is flowing, and you feel closer to this person than ever before. You take a sip from your glass, feel their lips on yours, and drift off to sleep in their arms feeling completely safe and loved. And you never wake up. This brings us to Alexander VI's eighth and perhaps most terrifying bedroom rule. Intimate encounters could serve as opportunities for assassination, where the most tender moments of human connection became delivery methods for death. Alexander VI and his family were master poisoners who turned the bedroom into the ultimate weapon, using love itself as a mask for murder. This wasn't just about eliminating political enemies. It was about creating a reign of terror so complete that even the most intimate human relationships became suspect. Let me start by explaining the Borgia family's relationship with poison, because it's more sophisticated and more widespread than most people realize. The Borgias didn't just use poison occasionally when other methods failed. They built an entire political strategy around the strategic use of toxins, and Alexander's private chambers became the primary laboratory for perfecting these deadly arts. Historical records suggest that Alexander personally supervised the development of what became known as Borgia poison, a slow-acting toxin that could be administered in tiny doses over time, creating symptoms that looked like natural illness rather than assassination. This poison was colorless, odorless, and virtually undetectable by the medical knowledge of the time. But here's what made Alexander's use of poison so psychologically devastating. He didn't just use it to kill people quickly and efficiently. He used it as a tool of psychological warfare, creating situations where people never knew whether intimate encounters might be their last. Let me tell you about how this actually worked in practice, because the details are going to shock you. Alexander would invite potential victims to private dinners in his personal apartments, creating an atmosphere of trust and intimacy that made poison delivery both easier and more psychologically devastating. These weren't formal political meetings where people might be on guard. They were personal, romantic encounters where victims were encouraged to let their defenses down completely. The papal private dining room became a death trap disguised as a lover's paradise. Expensive wines, exotic foods, beautiful companions, and intimate conversations created the perfect cover for administering deadly toxins. Victims died thinking they had experienced the most romantic evening of their lives. But Alexander's use of poisoned intimacy went beyond simple assassination. He used the threat of poison to control behavior and enforce loyalty in ways that traditional threats couldn't match. Here's how this worked. Alexander would invite someone to an intimate evening, treat them wonderfully, and then let them leave safely. But a few days later, they would receive a subtle message indicating that their wine had been specially prepared for them. The victim would be left wondering, was it a threat for the future? Or had they already been poisoned and were now living on borrowed time? This psychological uncertainty was more effective than actual poisoning in many cases. People who thought they might have been poisoned would do anything to gain access to potential antidotes, which Alexander claimed to possess. Victims became completely dependent on his continued goodwill, never knowing if they needed his help to stay alive. Let me describe a specific incident that shows how devastating this system could be. In 1500, Cardinal Giovanni Michiel, who had been opposing some of Alexander's political initiatives, was invited to a private dinner in the papal apartments. The evening was pleasant and romantic, with excellent food, fine wine, and charming company. 3 days later, Cardinal Michiel began experiencing symptoms that medieval medicine couldn't explain: fatigue, digestive problems, and a gradual decline in mental acuity. He consulted the best physicians in Rome, but none could identify the cause of his illness. Then, through intermediaries, he received a message suggesting that his condition might be related to his recent dinner with the Pope, and that Alexander possessed remedies that could help with his mysterious ailment. The message was subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, but clear enough to convey the real meaning. Cardinal Michiel immediately changed his political positions, becoming one of Alexander's most vocal supporters. His mysterious illness gradually improved, though he never regained his full health or mental sharpness. Whether he had actually been poisoned, or was simply responding to psychological manipulation, the effect was the same: complete submission to papal authority. But Alexander's use of poisoned intimacy wasn't limited to political enemies. Historical evidence suggests that he used similar techniques to control romantic partners, family members, and even close allies who showed signs of disloyalty or independence. The psychological impact of this system extended far beyond individual victims. Word spread throughout European high society that intimate encounters with the Borgia family could be literally deadly. This created a climate of fear that made normal romantic and social relationships almost impossible for anyone in Alexander's orbit. People began refusing invitations to papal gatherings, avoiding physical contact with Borgia family members, and even hiring food tasters for private dinners, precautions normally reserved for heads of state in times of war. Alexander had turned everyday social interactions into potential life or death situations. But here's where Alexander's genius for psychological manipulation really showed. He used the fear of poison to enhance his sexual power rather than diminish it. The danger of intimate contact with him made those contacts more intense and memorable, creating what psychologists would now recognize as trauma bonding. People who survived intimate encounters with Alexander often became addicted to the experience, craving the mixture of pleasure and terror that characterized his private gatherings. The possibility of death made every sensation more vivid, every emotion more intense, and every moment more precious. This psychological dynamic gave Alexander incredible power over his romantic partners. They weren't just afraid of disappointing him. They were literally risking their lives every time they pleased him. The stakes of sexual performance became ultimate, creating a level of submission and desperation that normal coercion couldn't achieve. Alexander also used the threat of poison to create loyalty networks among his lovers and associates. People who had survived potentially poisoned encounters felt special, chosen, and bonded to him in ways that transcended normal political or romantic relationships. They had faced death in his arms and lived to tell about it. Though, of course, the secrecy rules meant they couldn't actually tell anyone. The Borgia poison system also served as a form of quality control for Alexander's inner circle. People who were willing to risk death for intimate access to the Pope proved their absolute devotion in a way that no oath or promise could match. Survivors of poisoned intimacy became Alexander's most trusted agents because they had literally bet their lives on their relationship with him. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Alexander's poisoned intimacy was how it corrupted the very concept of love and trust. In a normal relationship, intimacy creates safety, and vulnerability creates closeness. In Alexander's world, intimacy created danger, and vulnerability created potential death sentences. This inversion of natural human bonding patterns had profound psychological effects on everyone involved. People learned to associate love with fear, pleasure with danger, and intimacy with potential betrayal. These psychological patterns spread beyond Alexander's immediate circle, influencing how romantic relationships worked throughout Renaissance Italian society. Historical accounts describe a generation of Roman nobles who could never fully trust their romantic partners, who hired food tasters for intimate dinners, and who approached love with the same caution normally reserved for battlefield tactics. Alexander's poisoned intimacy had literally infected the culture of romance throughout his sphere of influence. The legacy of Borgia poison extended far beyond Alexander's lifetime. For centuries afterward, Italian political families continued using similar techniques, creating a culture where intimate assassination became an accepted part of high-stakes politics. The phrase Borgia dinner became European slang for any social gathering that might be dangerous for attendees. But the most tragic legacy of Alexander's poisoned intimacy was how it demonstrated that even the most fundamental human needs for love, connection, and trust could be weaponized by someone with sufficient power and sufficient disregard for human dignity. Alexander VI showed the world that there was literally no human relationship so sacred, no moment so intimate, and no gesture so loving that it couldn't be turned into an instrument of death. In his hands, the bedroom didn't just become a place of political negotiation or sexual coercion. It became a battlefield where love itself was the ultimate casualty. So there you have it, the 8 strangest and darkest bedroom rules of Alexander VI, the Pope who turned the Vatican into his personal playground and rewrote the rules of power, intimacy, and human relationships in ways that still shock us more than 500 years later. Let's take a moment to recap what we've learned, because these aren't just historical curiosities. They're lessons about how power corrupts and how quickly civilization can be undermined when the people we trust most violate that trust completely. We started with the Banquet of Chestnuts, where Alexander demonstrated that he considered no space too sacred for his profane entertainments. We saw how he turned family relationships into political weapons, using his own daughter Lucrezia as bait in deadly games of European politics. We explored how he transformed power itself into a reward system where sexual satisfaction could literally buy you bishoprics, abbeys, and territories. We discovered his network of lover spies who turned pillow talk into intelligence operations and made genuine intimacy nearly impossible for anyone in his orbit. We witnessed the bedroom lottery, where intimate encounters became games of chance that terrorized Rome's elite and normalized sexual coercion through the illusion of random selection. We learned how he used the most sacred days of the Catholic calendar as opportunities for the most profane activities imaginable. We examined his system of enforced secrecy that made silence a matter of life and death, creating traumatic psychological conditions that lasted for years after people escaped his influence. And finally, we saw how he weaponized love itself through poisoned intimacy that turned the most tender human moments into potential death sentences. But here's what I want you to understand about why this history matters today. Alexander VI wasn't just some medieval monster whose story has no relevance to our modern world. The psychological techniques he pioneered, using intimacy as a weapon, turning family relationships into political tools, creating surveillance networks based on sexual relationships, weaponizing trust and vulnerability. These methods didn't disappear when he died in 1503. Throughout history, we've seen leaders use similar techniques to consolidate power and control populations. The specific methods change with technology and social structures, but the underlying psychology remains the same. Understanding how Alexander manipulated people helps us recognize when modern leaders try to use similar tactics. Think about it. How many times have you seen politicians use family members as political props? How often do powerful people create networks of loyalty based on personal relationships rather than professional competence? How frequently do leaders use the threat of social or professional destruction to enforce silence about their misconduct? The bedroom rules of Alexander VI show us the extreme end of what happens when power becomes completely divorced from moral responsibility. They demonstrate how quickly institutions that people trust, like the Catholic Church, can be corrupted from within by leaders who prioritize their personal desires over their public duties. But these stories also show us something hopeful. Alexander's reign of terror eventually ended. His victims found ways to survive and resist. The Catholic Church, despite the massive damage to its reputation and moral authority, eventually reformed and recovered. Truth has a way of emerging, even when powerful people try to suppress it through violence and intimidation. The historical records we've discussed today exist because people throughout Alexander's reign found ways to document and preserve the truth, despite the deadly consequences they faced for doing so. Johannes Burchard kept his detailed diary, knowing it could cost him his life. Foreign ambassadors sent reports to their home countries despite papal surveillance. Survivors eventually found safe spaces to tell their stories. This teaches us something crucial about resisting corruption and abuse of power. Documentation matters, truth-telling matters, and bearing witness matters even when it's dangerous. The people who preserved these historical accounts probably never imagined that their words would still be educating people 500 years later. But their courage in recording the truth has given us invaluable insights into how power corrupts and how corruption can be exposed. So what can we do with this knowledge? First, we can use it to become more aware of how manipulation and coercion work, making us less susceptible to similar tactics in our own lives. Second, we can support institutions and practices that promote transparency and accountability, making it harder for modern leaders to operate in the kind of secrecy that enabled Alexander's worst excesses. Third, we can remember that even the most powerful people in history eventually faced consequences for their actions. Alexander VI died suddenly in 1503, possibly from poison, a fitting end for someone who had used poison as a weapon throughout his career. His children lost their political power shortly after his death. The Borgia dynasty, despite all its wealth and influence, ultimately collapsed. The truth about Alexander's bedroom rules survived when his political empire didn't, which should give us hope that transparency and accountability eventually win out over corruption and secrecy, even when the corrupt have seemed untouchable for years. But perhaps the most important lesson from Alexander VI's story is this: the price of freedom and dignity is eternal vigilance. The moment we stop paying attention to how our leaders behave in private, the moment we accept that some people are above moral accountability, the moment we let fear silence our voices, that's when we risk creating conditions where another Alexander VI can emerge. If you found this deep dive into Renaissance papal politics as fascinating and disturbing as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We've got more historical investigations coming that will blow your mind and help you understand how the past connects to the present in ways you never expected. Next week, we're going to explore the secret network of female spies who helped bring down the Borgia dynasty, a story of how the victims of Alexander's bedroom rules eventually became the architects of his downfall. You won't want to miss it, and if you want to dive even deeper into this topic, check out the links in the description for primary source documents, scholarly analyses, and additional resources that will help you separate historical fact from later legend and propaganda. Remember, knowledge is power, truth matters, and the stories of the past can help us build a better future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.